The reason why we should not be afraid of losing the self is because the self is only an experience. The self is an experience of the self. The self is an experience of that which we see or experience as the self. We determine that this experience is the self. This experience is the experience of the self. We think that the self exists simply because we have an experience of that which we think or experience as the self. The self cannot exist without experience. We cannot have a self if we do not experience it. So the self is produced by our own experience. This is the phenomenology of it. We cannot have a self if we do not experience it. The experience of the self is something that is produced in the brain. Actually, the experience of the self is something that is produced, and the self as we think of the self is something that is produced in the brain. It's a synaptic activity. It's a product of electromagnetic activity between synapses in the neurocircuitry in our brain. The self is a product of the brain. The self is a product of brain activity. But we experience this self. We have an experience of it, and we experience with deeper heart, soul, essence, emotional faculties. We experience that which we experience simply because we are not only that which happens in the brain, we are the experience of that which happens in the brain. But at the same time, without the brain, it is very, very likely that we wouldn't have any experience of it. So the experience of that which happens in the brain actually also is a product of the brain. So in many ways we could say that everything comes from the brain. But the reason why we should not be afraid of losing the self is simply because it's just an experience. And we are addicted to the experience of self. This is why yogis become yogis. This is why masters become masters, because they reduce their own addiction to self. They make themselves able to live without the experience of self. They don't have to constitute the experience of self all the time. That's what we do normally in this world. We are addicted to the experience of self simply because we need it. We have trained ourselves to be addicted to the experience of the self because we use the self as a vehicle for ourselves, to present ourselves in the world and to the world. So this is a very important point. We use the self as a vehicle for ourselves, which means that we are not the self. We are not the self. The self is something that is produced. And we produce that self by activating that which gives us the experience of the self. This is why we shouldn't be afraid of losing it, because we can live perfectly well without that experience. We don't need that experience in order to live, in order to have a good life. We would also be more happy if we didn't have it in many ways, and that's why people like Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj is so important as gurus, because when they talk of the self, they talk of a different kind of self. They talk of an inner heart essence that is not a brain experience, you could say. Or let's make this distinction, even if the scientists among us will say that, yeah, but even that is a product of the brain. To see the self as the non-self in a way, or to use the absence of the brain-created self to use that as an opportunity for developing another kind of self, namely the witness of the self, or that in us which is capable of the experience of the self. We don't have to produce the self all the time, but we do think that we have to produce it because we were trained as kids in this way. You have to produce yourself, my son or my daughter, because if you don't produce yourself, then we cannot talk to you. You cannot defend yourself against abuse, and you cannot make and succeed in the tests at school if you don't produce the self that we need you to produce. So the production of the self is actually a form of blackmail, in the modern society. If you don't produce the self, then you're in trouble. You have to produce the self so that you can present yourself, so that you can come into being in this world as a self, as someone who lives in the self, as someone who is the self. But we are not the self. The self is a vehicle for ourselves. The self is an opportunity for us to experience ourselves as that which we call the self. The self is just an experience of that which we create and determine as the self. And this is created in the brain. It's something that happens in the neurocircuitry in the brain. The creation of the self are a synaptic activity between some parts of the brain. That's what constitutes that which we call the self, and also, not necessarily also, but that gives us the opportunity to experience the self, the product that we call the self, that which is produced. The self, that is the so-called self that is produced, is a product that we experience as the self. But the experience of that self is also so deeply connected and intertwined with the product itself, so it's basically not possible perhaps to discriminate between the two or to separate the two. The product of the self that is produced by the brain also contains the experience of the self, one could say. But this is just blah blah in a sense, but it is meaningful blah blah, If we can make sense out of this blah blah, then we can understand my point, that I'm trying to say that the self is an experience of something that is produced. Now we have determined that that which is produced by the brain. And we have not determined what it is that makes the experience of this product possible. Is the experience a part of the product, or is the experience separate from the product? Is the experience of the product something that exists in and of itself as a faculty separated from the production of the self in the brain? Well, we don't know that. That's a hugely difficult question, a very, very subtle, difficult question to answer for scientists, for brain scientists, for neuroscientists, for philosophers, for yogis, for anyone who has deep knowledge about this situation. But anyway, this is about, we should not be afraid to lose the self, because it's just an experience, and we can perfectly well live without that experience. We don't need it, actually. This makes me come back to something that I've said before, that individuality is more important than the self. I really like that, and I see that it's really true. Individuality is more important than the self. We should really protect our individuality and forget the self. We should, that's a good sentence. We should protect our own individuality, but we can forget the self, because the self is just a construction, it's just a mental construct. But our individuality is something sacred. It is our soul. It is our soul heart. It is that which is unique to us. It's the fingerprint of the soul. Our individuality is the fingerprint of the soul, you could say. That is sacred and that is unique. And it does not rely on the self. Our individuality exists even without the self, because the self is just, as we said, a mental construct. It's a product of the brain. To separate things like this, to study these things in our lab, which we do now, is very meaningful and funny and interesting. We should not be afraid of doing that. The people who do not like deep investigations into the self are usually those that are regarded as happy and as normal and sane and healthy. But in reality, they are people who are completely lost within their own box. They are limited by their own box, by their so-called sanity. The insane of the insane group, we who are clever, the philosophers, the solitary geniuses, we who are crazy, we are the real sane persons, because we have the guts and the stamina and the power and the substance and the authenticity to actually investigate these things and to find it meaningful to do so, which is a mark of quality in a way. It's a mark of authenticity, and it's a mark of nobleness, you could say. It's a mark of nobility. Because, of course, also transparency is the only nobility. If you can be transparent, you also have nobility in you. And if you cannot hide, if you cannot lie, then you are really noble, because you have to be transparent. And if you are transparent, you have to admit that, well, the self is something that is related to experience, and if I don't experience that which we call the self, then I'm selfless, so to speak. Well, I'm just talking. This is just talk. But it's meaningful, and if you're clairvoyant, you can find a lot of meaning in it, and if you're just attentive and intelligent, you'll see that, well, this is actually interesting, which it is, because we are living in the century of self, which we have done for the last 200 years. The last 2 centuries have been the century of self. And now we are sick because of the way that we focus on the self. We are sick because we have not investigated the self enough. We are sick because we haven't freed ourselves from the concept of self. The very concept of self is that which makes us limited, because the self is just a minor part of us. Individuality, as I said, is much more important. Individuality is much more sacred. Individuality is the church of man, and the self is just the altar where we have to sacrifice ourselves, where we live and die. Individuality is the church in itself, is the temple, is the building. The self is just the altar inside it, where we have to crucify ourselves, where we have to live and die. Within the self as a vehicle, but we will live perfectly fine as individuality outside of that self. We can sacrifice our own self and not lose anything. We can sacrifice our own self and not lose anything else but our own troubles, because our own troubles is connected to that which we call the self. So we need to release ourselves from the self, in a way, because we have made the self to be so much more important than what it actually is. What we need is individuality. The self is just something that limits us, is a prison, is a mental prison, it's a mind prison. The self is a construct that is supposed to be a representation of identity, and that identity is fake. True identity is actually just individuality. It's our soul, it's the fingerprint of our soul. That's our identity. Identity in the self is just a mental construct. It's just a business card, it's just a snapshot, a screenshot, a photograph. We don't need that. What we need is the living individuality, or what we need is the soul of the individuality, the individuality of our inner essence, which is unique to us. And the self is just a construct, it's just a box that we keep in the mind, and we trying to put our identity into that box, and so that we can use that box as a vehicle for presenting ourselves, as a tool for presenting ourselves. Anyway, so the main point was actually we should not be afraid to lose the self, because we will not lose ourselves. We will not lose ourselves by losing the self. We will actually gain ourselves by losing the self, because the self is not actually a part of that which we truly, authentically are. The self is a mental construct that separates ourselves from our true authenticity, from our true individuality. So the whole business of self is completely exaggerated and taken out of proportion, and it has made people sick. People suffer because of this, and we don't think that we're good enough. We cannot be loved because we have been trained to think wrongly about the self. The self is not important. It doesn't exist apart from the construct that we experience when we produce it, when we activate that which gives us the experience of it. We need to activate that which gives us the experience of self. We have to become aware of that which is the experience of self in order for the self to communicate with us, so to speak, for it to become apparent to us, for it to become essential to us and to our own beingness. Anyway, so we should not be afraid to lose the self, because we will not lose ourselves by losing the self. We should be free to give up the self and see that actually we didn't lose anything. We just gained more freedom. We gained more ability to be flexible inside our own individuality. By giving up the self, we became more natural and fluid and flexible inside our own individuality, which is perhaps that which we need, more than being stuck in the concept of self, more than being stuck in the limited box of the construct of self. So this was just a little donation to the pot of that which is the exploration of self. We should have, that should be a big part of, that should be a part of public society, the exploration of the self. The foundation for the exploration of the self. This is the foundation for the exploration of the self. It's an important activity for the well-being of society and for mankind as it is. So we should teach ourselves to be more flexible when it comes to our own relationship with that which we call the self. Thank you.